Okay. Hello everyone. So today's game plan is going to be a little bit different, but essentially we're going to be starting off with something called the ECG, which is basically how your heart sets its pulse and how to read that. Like in the movies, you might have seen those like ECG diagrams, like those beeps of the hearts with those like lines. We'll basically be exploring how that works and how the heart sets its pace. And we'll also be exploring how like the sound of the lub dub actually comes from the heart a bit as well. And so that's just a sort of continuation off of our circulatory system, which we did not fully cover in that class. So I will finish off that. And then after we'll go into our respiratory unit. And this lesson is pretty short as there isn't too much to talk about, I would say. But it's gonna be a decently interesting one. And then after we finish our respiratory unit, I think we will have some time left after that. So after that, I do have a booklet, and the booklet is just gonna be based off of the circulatory system, which we learned on the start of April, and so we'll be going over that for the remainder of the class time. Okay, yeah, so the ECG and the lub dub. So like how to read the ECG and how the heart really beats correctly. And you really don't want your heart beating incorrectly because that will mess up your circulation. And so your heartbeat. So your heart beats in a steady rhythm controlled by the electric signals and pulses actually. And so this is a brief diagram which I'll be diving deep into today. And this is essentially the electrical pathway of the heart. And so the normal beat of a heart roughly is around 60 to 100 beats per minute, depending on your age, gender, etc. It can be too slow, which is a condition called bradycardia, too fast or irregular. And the signal essentially starts in your SA node, which is over here, and it's your heart's natural pacemaker. And just to know, although the heart often does beat individually, just by itself, like isolated, it is obviously controlled by many other things, such as nerves. For example, like we talked about in our last class for the nervous system, I think we mentioned something about our sympathetic nervous system, which activates your fight or flight response via hormones like adrenaline or cortisol. And essentially, so those hormones can actually like bind to these heart cells and it could just make the heart beat faster. And so starting off with the SA nodes, the SA node is located on the right atrium of the heart. So if you most diagrams of the heart, when you look at it, the SA node will be on the left, of your left of the diagram, but we obviously want to know that the picture is kind of like facing you. So the left side of the picture that you're looking at is actually the right side. So on average heart diagrams like this side over here that I'm pointing at would be your right side, and then this side would be your left side. And so essentially, the SA node is on the right atrium of the heart. And I believe we talked about this, but just a review, these top parts of the heart. So your heart is four chambers, right? And the top two parts are called the atrium. So your right atrium, your left atrium, and then your right ventricle and your left ventricle. So the SA node is on the right atrium and essentially sets the pace by sending electrical signals to trigger each heartbeat. And it controls your resting heart rate. And like I said before, that's usually about 60 to 100 beats per minute. And it's influenced by your nervous system, hormones. Like I said, adrenaline speeds it up, and other things slows it down as well. So now the AV node. So it kind of acts as a relay station for electrical signals. So you can kind of think of it as the bridge between the atrium and the ventricle. You can see here, this is the ventricle, this is the atrium. You can see how the AV node through these things called internodal pathways goes to the AV node. And so this SA node transmits signals to the AV node. And inside the AV node, it kind of delays the signal. So it delays the signal by a small fraction of time. And something very interesting happens when it's delayed And this is how your entire heart works. Because think about it. If you have this SA node and sending pulses, right? And because electricity and light travels extremely fast. So if this SA node is constantly sending pulses, what do you think will happen? Well, the heart will just all contract at once, right? Each time the SA node sends a beat, the heart will contract. Um, and so that wouldn't be very efficient as 2 weeks ago we explored how the heart actually pumps blood, right? The atrium first pumps the blood into the ventricle while the ventricle relaxes, and then the ventricle pumps blood throughout the body or to the lungs, right? And so you don't want the entire heart contracting at once. You want the atria to contract and then the ventricle to contract. So what this AV node allows it to do is it allows it to delay the signal so that the arteries contract and then the ventricles contract. So it delays the signal. It also passes the signal to the ventricles via the bundle of His and other stuff that we'll talk about. It can also take over as a backup pacemaker if the SA node fails, but it's usually at a slower rate. And as you guys could imagine, it's not very great because it won't activate the atria as much as well. And so next, moving on, we have the SA node, transmit the signals to the AV node, the AV node delays it, and then we move on to the bundle of His. And the bundle of His is this sort of line that acts as kind of like the bridge between the atrium and the ventricles. And so, yeah, it carries electrical signal from the AV node to the ventricles. It also splits into the right and left bundle ventricles for each separate ventricle, right? So the right bundle of His and the left bundle of His. You see here, right bundle of His and the left bundle of His. And these bundle of His also runs like in this V shape down the ventricle. So it gets to all the muscle cells, right? And so like these chambers are obviously empty, but surrounding them are all your heart muscle cells. And so each time the electrical signal comes through, all these muscles contract. So that's why it's in sort of a V shape. And also just a note, these are 2D diagrams, so it's going to be obviously drawn into V shape. But in reality, this is all 3D, so it more or likely look like a cone sort of. And it also ensures coordinated contractions of the heart lower centrals, the chambers, my bad, ventricles. So it makes sure that the signal goes into both these ventricles at the same time and at the same strength. Finally, we reach the Purkinje fibers. And these Purkinje fibers are essentially like, you could think of it as small branches branching off the bundle of His. And they kind of, you can really see how it like kind of spreads the electrical signal through the ventricles. It ensures rapid coordinated contraction for strong blood pumping. It's also the final step in the heart's conduction system. And the reason why you don't see a structure like this in the atrium is because the atria don't need to contract that hard, right? They only need to pump blood into the ventricles. It's actually the ventricles that do all the work and pump the blood throughout your entire body. So to overview the pathway, just to jog your memory, it starts in the SA node over here. It sends a signal to the via internal pathways. And also, I forgot to mention, but some of the internal pathways actually goes to your left atrium over here as well. And then reach the AV node. As you can see in this kind of GIF that I found, it delays it. You can see it travels really fast, but then it delays it over here. And then it goes to the bundle of His, which splits into two, and it finally goes to the Purkinje fibers. And you can really see the importance of the AV node. You can see here the atrium contract, right? Boom, contracts. And then if there was no this dilation, the entire heart would contract at once, right? But because of this dilation, this contracts first, it relaxes, and then this contracts. The ventricles contract after that contract. So you have this good beat pulse. And so you guys might have seen this diagram. I'm sure you guys have seen it before if you watch movies or TV shows or anything related to that sort. You might have seen in movies where it goes like beep, beep, and then when it flatlines, well, the patient's dead or whatever, right? And so today we'll actually be exploring like what this even is and what is reading, what each wave means, etc. Why the flat line means like death, essentially. So we first start off with something we call the P wave. And this represents the arterial depolarization. And its appearance is a small upward deflection of the ECG. So it's kind of like a small bump, you could say, or it's not a, yeah, it's like a small bump or hill, and its duration is typically 0.12 seconds or less, and its significance, which just means like its clinical significance, so we're talking about the significance of it being like too big or too small, is that it indicates arteria are contracting properly. And if we recall from our nervous system before, about depolarization, right? Depolarization is how neurons, they become activated, right? And so the P wave measures the depolarization of the neurons in the arterial chambers. So you can see that the arterial doesn't need to pump that strong of blood, right? So the bump is not that large, and so that's what we call the P wave. And that's located over here, highlighted in yellow, and it's at the start of this kind of complex. And then we have the PR segment, which is just in between the P and the R. And so the PR segment is a time between the P wave and the start of the QRS complex, we call it. And the duration is typically about 0.12 to 0.2 seconds. And the significance is represents the delay at the AV node, and it allows the ventricles to fill, right? So this kind of segment over here represents, remember, that delay from the AV node from the SA node. Moving on, we have the QRS complex, which is this big spike that I think many of you guys will be interested about. So the QRS complex essentially just represents the ventricular depolarization. So remember the P wave was for the arterial depolarization, but the QRS complex is for the ventricular depolarization. And this is the reason why you see it's like a big spike and it's so much more different. Is because the ventricles, like I said, are much bigger, they're much powerful, and they need more power to be able to pump blood throughout the body. And so that's why the depolarization activity of the ventricles, which mainly comes from all those Purkinje fibers that we talked about, are much larger. Its duration is typically 0.08 to 0.12 seconds, and its significance, it shows electrical impulse traveling through the ventricles causing contraction. And so after that, we have our ST segment, which just represents the depolarization and the repolarization. So it's the time in between the depolarization and the repolarization. Quick note, the ST segment is not the time where the ventricles repolarize. The ST segment is just the period between that. And it's normally just flat, and changes can indicate heart issues like ischemia. And I think I forgot to mention this, but the ECG reads the electrical activity of your heart. So essentially reads the electrical activity, how large it is, etc. Finally, we have the T wave, and this is actually where the ventricles repolarize. And we can see here that when the arteria contract, P wave, PR segment is the arteria are repolarizing, but nothing shows up because that repolarization is so small, like we talked about. But we see here in the ventricles that the repolarization is actually shows a significant bump on the graph, right? And so abnormal T waves, its significance can indicate issues like we talked about ischemia or electrolyte disturbances. And electrolyte disturbances, like we talked about in our last class, are, remember, those sodium ions, those chloride ions, potassium ions, those large negative proteins and stuff like that. Those are your electrolytes. And electrolytes are very important for your nerves to function. Yeah, and so next we're moving on to how the heart makes this lub dub sound, like we talked about. If you listen to your heart, you get that lub dub sound. And so the lub dub comes from the tricuspid and the dicuspid valves closing. And so when the arteria contract, they pump blood into the ventricles, like we talked about. And then when the ventricles contract, they pump blood throughout, like either to the pulmonary circuit or to the aorta, right? And so if the blood flows from here to here, and this part pumps, we only want blood going through here. We do not want blood going back into the arteries. So what happens is these valves close to prevent that, like we talked about a couple classes ago. And this is what makes your lub sound, the closing of these. And the dub sound is actually made by your artery and pulmonary valves closing. And so, like we mentioned, when the ventricles contract and then the arteries pump blood into there, we don't want blood coming back, right? Because when the you could think of it as like a closed chamber. When you squeeze like hard to say, when you squeeze like a plastic water bottle, right? And then you open it again, air rushes in, right? So when these ventricles contract and then they decontract, they have more space. So it's when they contract and then they decontract, they have more space. So they're pulling in blood from these other places, and we don't want that to happen. So that's the dub sound, which is these valves closing over here. And yeah, so just briefly, you can see you can really see here how the diagram works. And so blood is pumped here, right? And then when the ventricles contract, blood flows through here, but it cannot flow through here. And then because of that, bringing, like you see the ventricles like relaxing and the arteria pumping blood into it, this closes. So when that's relaxing, it doesn't pull blood from here. And that's the end of this presentation. Next, we're going to be moving on to the respiratory system. So that's going to cover, so your circulatory system and your respiratory system work together because we didn't really explore this, but the circulatory system has blood, like we talked about. And what does blood contain? Blood contains what's the most important part of the blood is your red blood cells, and those contain oxygen. That is essentially the main point of blood, is to bring oxygen and to get rid of carbon dioxide. And how do they do that? Well, they do it through your lungs. And so I'm not sure if, yeah, it's not really stated in this slide, but I will quickly bring up a visual on Google if I can find it. And so essentially, you have your heart and your lungs, they're connected through what we call the pulmonary circuit. Yeah, here we go. I think I got it. If you can see here, we have our heart. And we did talk about the left ventricle pumping into the aorta, and then that aorta goes to all the different areas of the body. But when the right ventricle pumps, it actually pumps into something we call the pulmonary circuit. And it specifically pumps to the pulmonary artery. And so when this blood is pumped here, it goes around. And you can see how the heart pumps blood into the lungs, sorry, not technically into the lungs, but pumps blood into the blood vessels that go into the lungs. They pick up oxygen, they come back into the left ventricle, oxidized, and then they get pumped back to the body. So again, blood is deoxygenated, right? Because your body used it. It comes into the heart, gets pumped into the lungs where it picks up oxygen, and then it comes back and then gets pumped to the rest of the body. So it's the relationship between the respiratory system and the circulatory system that really help your body to function and stay alive. And so next, right there, we got to talk about the respiratory system. Why is it a video? That's kind of weird, but let's see if this works. Yeah, this should work. Anyways, your respiratory system. So we're talking about things like your lungs, gas exchange, and your diaphragm. So the anatomy of your lungs. So essentially, your lungs help you breathe, which all you guys know of. Air goes in through your nose or mouth, and your nose and mouth are actually connected. You guys might have heard of this before, but they're connected essentially. Down the windpipe into the lungs, your windpipe, which is called your trachea. And inside it spreads through tiny tubes and ends in air sacs where oxygen goes into the blood and carbon dioxide comes out. Yeah, so in this diagram, we really see how the mouth and noses are connected. So in the back of your throat, air from your nostril and air from your mouth, they all collect in the same area. So you can breathe through your mouth or breathe through your nose. So you guys might be wondering, what is the point of the nose if we can just breathe through the mouth? No. First thing, nose allows sense of smell. That's pretty obvious, but I think another main important thing that I like you guys to keep in mind is that breathing through your nose is better than breathing through your mouth. Those have your nose hairs, and they help block out germs and like bacteria and particles that when you breathe in. And then those also helps moisturize the air and keep it warm. So if you can, try breathing through your nose much more often than your mouth. I'm sure a lot of you guys do this, but definitely do it. But definitely don't stick to like just breathing through your mouth because breathing through your nose is actually beneficial to a lot of your body. And so obviously the first step of breathing is when you breathe in, right? Breathe in through your nose, breathe in through your mouth, and it goes down and it collects down here. And then after, I like to just talk about how do you actually breathe? Like I know it sounds pretty obvious, but how do you breathe? How do you get air inside of you? Like it's not like you have a fan blowing into your nose or something, right? And so how you actually breathe is we're going to explore that a bit later, and it has to do with something called your diaphragm. And so essentially back here, we see that the air comes, and there's this kind of contraption over here that is very, very important to your survival. So you have two pipes actually going down your neck or your throat. So first we have our esophagus, which is the tube that goes down to your digestive system, which we'll talk about later. So that's where your food and water goes down to. And then you have your windpipe, or you call it the trachea, and that's where the air goes down through. Now imagine if you were drinking water and food and all that went down your air pipe. Well, that wouldn't be good, would it? It just clog your air and you wouldn't be able to breathe in. No oxygen exchange will occur and you won't be able to undergo cellular respiration. And a lot of bad things will occur. Essentially, we do not want food and water going down this windpipe. We only want food and water going down the esophagus. So there's this little contraction called the epiglottis, which just helps to block the windpipe when food is coming down. Just something to keep in mind. And also, just something not really related to the lesson, but just basic life lessons. Um, when you're eating, pay attention to what you eat. Don't be scrolling on your phone or doing something else because um that epiglottis that's helping prevent food from going down your windpipe is better controlled when you're actually paying attention to eating. Like although it's something we do passively, we can't control if the epiglottis lifts or closes, right? Or else that wouldn't be very good. But although it's controlled by like your automatic nervous system, the automatic nervous system needs to know that you're eating in the first place to actually be able to close it. And so essentially, if you're just not paying attention to eating and you're just like scrolling through your phone, although it's a very low chance because obviously your body still knows to some extent that you're eating, it could happen that the body just kind of misses and doesn't close it, and that's very problematic. If you get water in your lungs, it's very, very bad. You can get infections, etc., pneumonia, etc. And so you want to pay attention to what you're eating and actually do eating when you're eating. Don't get too distracted so your body can properly close that epiglottis and make the food go down the proper pipe. Okay, so next we move on to the trachea, which is your windpipe. And the windpipe is the wind sorry, the windpipe is essentially a tube, and you can see there's kind of like these bone structures around here, which are kind of weird. But essentially, these bone structures help keep the windpipes steady. And why do we need that? So just a quick fun question. What if a trachea had no cartilage? So instead of exploring why it has cartilage, let's explore what happened if it doesn't have cartilage. What would happen if it doesn't have cartilage is the trachea will collapse easily, airflow to lungs will be blocked, breathing will become difficult or impossible, and it can't withstand the changes in air pressure during breathing. A lot of these points you guys won't understand because we will understand them when we get to the process of breathing via the diaphragm. But essentially, you could kind of think of it as we breathe, the trachea would like kind of contract. It wouldn't allow air to flow through it because we're kind of sucking in air. The trachea would like stick to each other essentially. And this is just a quick video on the bronchial tree. And so we can see here that after the trachea comes down, it splits into, so you have two lungs, obviously, but when the trachea comes down, it splits into two different bronchi. And these bronchi branch out into even more smaller bronchi and segments. And those all eventually split around, kind of like a tree. And then eventually it ends up in these tiny air sacs called alveoli, which we'll explore in the next couple slides. Um, hopefully you guys can hear this. I'm gonna actually just reshare this to ensure that you guys can hear it.
The trachea or the windpipe divides at the level of T4 vertebra into right main bronchus and left main bronchus. We will keep in mind that the right main bronchus is wider, shorter, and more vertical than the left main bronchus, which is twice as long and runs more horizontally. The right main bronchus divides into three lobar bronchi: the right superior lobar bronchus, the middle lobar bronchus, and the right inferior lobar bronchus. The left main bronchus divides into two lobar bronchi: the left superior lobar bronchus and left inferior lobar bronchus. Further on, those lobar bronchi divide into segmental bronchi, which have proper names but are also labeled with Roman numerals. The right superior lobar bronchus divides into apical segmental bronchus, or B1, posterior segmental, or B2, and anterior segmental, or B3. The middle lobar bronchus divides into lateral segmental, or B4, and medial segmental, or B5. The right inferior lobar bronchus divides into 5 segmental bronchi as follows: superior segmental, or B6, medial basal, or B7, anterior basal, or B8, lateral basal, B9, and posterior basal, B10. The left superior lobar.
Yeah, I'm not gonna finish the video because all I wanted is all I wanted you to see from this video is like how everything looks and how everything kind of works. And so I just wanted you to grasp the
Bronchus
sense that like this trachea splits into a bunch of different areas that then allow you to undergo gas exchange. Because essentially the air that comes in, you want to maximize the amount of surface area that air contacts. So by branching off into more smaller branches and reaching more alveoli, it can heighten and largen those surface area contacts, which allow more gas exchange to occur. You can kind of think of it as um, you can think of it as having one large balloon. That inner surface area would like you could think of it as like having one large ball that is hollow. Think having a large one balloon or a ball. And say that large balloon or ball can fit 100 smaller balloons or balls. Which of those objects, 100 smaller balloons vs 100 vs one bigger balloon, the 100 smaller balloons can fit inside the bigger balloon, would have a higher sort of surface area? Well, obviously the smaller ones, right? So that's essentially what this kind of system is trying to do. Yeah, and to go over a really brief overview, the trachea leads down to kind of like different bronchi, and this is your lungs. And so after all that crazy branching, what does it finally lead to? it leads to your alveoli sacs. And this is what they look like. So here is the very small bronchi segments, and they split into these things called alveoli. And these are these kind of sacs that allow gas exchange to occur. So air enters through here, and through the process of partial pressure diffusion, which we'll explore later. Essentially, you have these arteries that come out and kind of blend into these sacs, and you have the veins that blend into these sacs. Essentially, what happens inside these sacs is that gas exchange occurs, right? So oxygen is put into the blood, and carbon dioxide is put into the alveoli. And so here we have the vein that carries the deoxygenated blood that is pumped by your heart because your body used it, pumps it right next to these alveoli. Gas exchange occurs over here, and then it gets pumped, and then it gets collected into the arteries, and that gets back to the heart, which then pumps to the rest of your system. So gas exchange, the magic of it all. So it happens in the alveoli, like we talked about. Oxygen goes in, carbon dioxide goes out. So oxygen goes into the blood, or more specifically into the red blood cells in the hemoglobin inside the iron structure, and carbon dioxide diffuses out into the alveoli to be breathed out by you. And it uses simple diffusion, so requires no ATP input or no energy input. And the alveoli are coated with thin, moist walls that make sure that this diffusion is picture perfect and very efficient. And like we talked about with that analogy of small balloons and big balloons, we really see that alveoli really try to maximize the surface area. And something called partial air pressure, or just air pressure in general, helps the gases move. So what is partial pressure even? Partial pressure is the pressure exerted by a single gas in a mixture. According to Dalton's law, which you guys don't need to know, the total pressure is the sum of partial pressures of each gas. So it's essentially like how much particles of gas are in the air. And so that is how you calculate partial pressure. And remember, from diffusion, molecules move from a more concentrated area to a less concentrated area. Well, essentially, partial pressure just states that one area that has a higher partial pressure has a higher concentration of that element. And so gases and molecules will always move from a place of higher partial pressure to lower partial pressure. And this is just how to calculate partial pressure using Dalton's law. So essentially, the pressure that is exerted by one molecule plus the pressure that's exerted by the other molecule, and that's the total amount of partial pressure in a gas. And so here we go. These are the partial pressures of the blood. So we see that when the deoxygenated blood enters comes in contact with the capillaries through the veins or through the pulmonary arteries, if the partial pressure of oxygen here is 40, and the partial pressure of CO2 is 46, and the outside air that we breathe in, the partial pressure of oxygen in the outside air is 104, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40. And you think about, wait, why are they different? Well, like we recall, your cells need oxygen for cellular respiration, as acting as the final electron receptor for the electron transport chain, and your cells produce CO2, like we all know that, right? And so essentially, the deoxygenated blood that's carrying the waste and the used oxygen comes into the capillaries, and you can kind of guess what happens, right? The oxygen will move from a place of higher partial pressure into a place of lower partial pressure. So oxygen will go into the blood, and so the red blood cells will pick that up, and the CO2, we can see that partial pressure is higher in the blood because the cells have expelled CO2, and so that will go into the alveoli and out through exhaled air, because the partial pressure is higher inside the blood than compared to the outside air. And so it is this process that allows your blood cells to get, or allows all your cells to get, a constant supply of oxygen, along with effective removal system for carbon dioxide. And you can see when the blood exits, it has a much higher partial pressure of oxygen and a much lower partial pressure of carbon dioxide, which is good for the cells. finally, we get to how you breathe, how you actually breathe. And we breathe through something called negative pressure breathing. So every time you inhale, your diaphragm contracts and moves downward. So it's kind of hard to explain, but when you're breathing, how do you guys think you breathe? Well, there's no muscles in your lungs, your nose, your mouth. There's no muscles that help you breathe there. The only muscle that helps you breathe is this green thing called it is a muscle and it's called a diaphragm. And essentially what the diaphragm does is it pulls down. It goes, you can see it goes down. And what this downward force do is it pulls on the lungs. It enlarges the lungs. And so the lungs, when they enlarge, when they have more space, they pull air from the outside. And that's what we call negative pressure breathing. It's like it's negative pressure because we're not like, you could think of positive pressure as if we had a sort of system that is blowing air into your lungs like 24/7. We have like a fan that's blowing air into your lungs, and negative pressure as we have a system below it that's drawing air, that's allowing air to come through. So that's the difference, right? And so every time you inhale, your diaphragm contracts and moves downward, and this expands your chest cavity and allows you to breathe. And so this expansion lowers the pressure inside your lungs because it's more space, less air molecules. And because air moves from high to low pressure, it rushes into your lungs. And yeah, these two datas really explain the kind of chemistry, more complicated a bit of the version of how you breathe. How I explained it was just simple. It enlarges, so air comes through. You can see over here. But the more kind of complicated process goes something like this, which I'll actually explain because I think it's just much better. So your lungs, they have a set space, right? They have, let's just say, 10 ounces of air space inside of it, right? 10 ounces of airspace for uh, 10 grams of air molecules. These is extremely, extremely arbitrary numbers, but whatever. We have 10 ounces and 10 grams of air molecules. When the diaphragm contracts, moves downward, the airspace in your lungs, you can see in this GIF as well, become larger. So what happens? Now say your space in your lungs is 15 ounces with 10 grams of air molecules. If we calculate the concentration of air molecules inside your lungs from before it enlarges to after it enlarges, we find that the concentration of air molecules inside your lungs after it enlarges is much lower, right? Because there's more space to fill out only a certain amount of air molecules. And like we said, air that has higher partial pressure will always move to lower partial pressure. The air outside has a higher partial pressure compared to the air inside because your lungs expanded. And so that's the driving force that drives air into your lungs every time you breathe. And so that's the end of the respiratory lesson. Next, we'll be moving on to our buckets. So good to set them up. Okay, here we go. What games do you guys want to play? You can just message me if you have a specific game you want to play. And by the way, this book is going to be about the circulatory system. I'm a bit behind on the buckets. I don't know why. It's just some classes we run out of a bit of time. I'll give it like one minute for you guys to, if you guys have any game modes, you can just privately message me or something. And then if we don't have any, I'll just go with essentially a random one. Yeah, okay. I'm just gonna pick a game. Let's see which one's good. Hmm, I think we can go with like Simple Cafe. Yeah, I think that'd work. Let's play Cafe. Um, sure, we can go for 10 minutes. I'll copy the link. Give it a couple 1 or 2 minutes for you guys to join up, and then I'll start the game. Yeah, I just started it. All right, that's the end of the game. Hope you guys learned something. And I hope you guys review some material we learned. That's the end of today's class. Next class, we'll be going over the digestive system, which is pretty interesting. A lot of different components. So have a good week, and I'll see you next week.